Hi, I'm Valerie Edwards, editorial assistant for Fostering Families Today. Thanks for joining us. We continue our 2022 webinar series titled Tough Conversations with a look at the intersection of race, foster care, and adoption. In a few minutes, we'll meet our panelists. All are transracial adoptees, and some have spent time in foster care. Each offers a unique perspective on their lives, which they'll share, along with some advice and suggestions for interracial foster and adoptive families, as well as those considering fostering or adopting a child of a different race. That's coming up. Fostering Families Today is a bi-monthly publication dedicated to informing, engaging, and educating foster, adoptive, and kinship families. As always, you can find us at fosteringfamiliestoday.com and on the various social media platforms. And stay with us because we have a pair of audience participation questions coming up. We're going to need some feedback from you on that. In the meantime, if you've got a question or a comment for any of our guests, please feel free to drop them in the chat feature. We've got a lot to talk about today, but I promise we'll try to get to as many as possible. Tony Hines joins us today to lend his expertise and insight to our conversation. He is a trainer and educator with the Center for Adoption Support and Education, where he works with adoptive families, social workers, judges, and consuls, truly anyone who cares about children. Tony is also an interracial adoptee. He is the author of The Son with Two Moms and writes about his experience growing up in a same-sex led household. Tony Hines, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It is indeed a pleasure to have you. In your role as an adoption trainer and educator, Tony, what is the uppermost thing you want people to understand about transracial foster care and adoption?
It's a great question. Well, one thing I really want to help families understand is that adoption, interracial adoption, this is a lifelong journey. This isn't something that is going to stop being important for your kids when they turn 18 years old. It's not going to stop being important when they're 25. So what do we do with that? Well, we support them at different developmental ages, giving them the tools, the resources, the sense of wellness, the sense of well-being that they need to operate successfully and in a healthy manner in this world as kids being raised in interracial adoptive households. So I know that your questions are pointing to those facets, and I look forward to hearing from the panelists and adding to the discussion in any way that's helpful. So thank you again.
I am certain, Tony, that it's going to be a very interesting and very dynamic conversation. But before we go any further, I want to share with our audience and share with our panelists that you might hear some things that are triggering. You might hear some things that are uncomfortable to talk about. You know, Tony, we talked about it before. Race is one of the hardest things for anyone, for family to sit down and talk about, much less a group of strangers. But we're going to do it today. And I'm certain our panelists are going to share something, and we're all going to learn something new. You know, one thing I wanted to clarify, we're talking about adoptees today, but can what you're telling me be applicable to interracial foster care situations as well?
Yes, it certainly can. And we see that many of the issues that interracial adoptive families, many of the challenges that they're going through are also challenges that are present in foster families too. When we talk about a child who's interacting in a school system that is not a diverse school system, and they're hearing maybe racist things at school, or maybe they're feeling that they feel racially isolated in their environments, or maybe they feel like they don't have the connections with their birth family that they would like to, and the racial implications of what that might mean for them. Those things are going on in foster households too. And so it's important for parents and prospective parents to hear about these stories because they're applicable in so many different avenues.
Yeah, we're going to hear from our panelists to see perhaps if they've encountered the sort of what do we call microaggressions in the school system, and how do parents deal with them, and how do they deal with them? Did I say transracial and you say interracial?
That's correct.
What's the difference?
So technically, there's no difference between the terms transracial and interracial. They mean the same thing. They mean being an adoptive family that is adopted across race, meaning the person that you've adopted is a different race from you. I choose to use the term interracial, though, for a few reasons. One of the reasons is that I'm doing my research right now on adult interracial adoptees and social connectedness among adult interracial adoptees. In the course of my research, I discovered that the term transracial adoption originated in the 1960s and the 1970s from social workers, from adoptive parents, from prospective adoptive parents who were envisioning kind of this post-racial, colorblind society to raise their kids in. And they were saying that, you know what? Raising kids in cross-cultural environments is a sign of progress in and of itself. And
Yeah.
we should be honoring that by having this term transracial, post-race. And so this became a term that was used at the time interchangeably with interracial adoption. As we moved forward in time, in the 90s, we saw that the term interracial was dropped and that transracial was the predominant term that began to be used. I was just speaking with someone today who is trans, and they were telling me, and this person is also an interracial adoptee, and they were telling me, I don't like that we use the term transracial because we're not transitioning to a different race of family, right? We're not transitioning in any way racially. We exist as, in more applicable terms, an interracial family structure. And so it's more accurate for myself and for some other adoptees who feel similarly to address ourselves as interracial adoptees. I also tell people that just because I use the term interracial adoptee, if you're an interracial adoptee who uses the term transracial adoptee, it doesn't mean that I'm expecting or that you need to use the terminology I use. But I choose to use that term for those reasons, because I feel it's most appropriate for me, and because I do not feel we should be operating in a place of colorblindness or in any terminology that is indicative of wanting to have the colorblind perspective that we know has been detrimental when it comes to raising children in family structures like ours.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's something I want to talk about later with the panelists. Can children be raised in a colorblind society, or is it something that's unattainable? Is it simply enough to say color doesn't matter? We'll get back to that a little later. Tony, tell me, what role does trauma play in the emotional and psychological development of an interracially fostered or adopted child?
Well, I always like to start by answering this question by stating that adoption does not start with trauma, but the process leading to adoption, right, starts from trauma. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that when a child is separated from their birth family, there's trauma laden in that separation. When a child is separated from their birth family, physiologically difficulties, challenges are happening in their brain. The sounds, the smells that they are used to, the touch, the connection that they've built to their birth parents and their birth mothers, especially during those times prenatally, during those times directly following
You're
birth.
saying this is happening prenatally?
Correct.
Okay, okay.
Correct. These things, these connections are happening prenatally. And what happens when that child is born is they still are feeling physiologically that connection. And so the dopamine levels of the mother, of the child are at higher levels when they are born, for those reasons, for the reasons of that connection. And so when that connection is severed by literally someone not only taking the baby for a few minutes or an hour, but away.
Yeah.
That connection is severed. And so that it's a process that is a process of trauma then that the child is moving forward with having. So the child has lost that sense of connectedness to that parent or to those parents right away. So even if we have a child who was adopted as a newborn, that's why that trauma piece is still there. And of
Yeah.
course, when we're getting into talking more today, we will address too the trauma that is happening sometimes developmentally as that child is getting older. There's also trauma, of course, the child is moving from placement to placement within the foster care system, and trauma in regard to if the child then is being adopted into a new family that they're expected to attach to pretty readily. So they're thinking of their birth family, and do I have loyalty now only to my adopted family, to my forever family? Do I have, are they for my forever family? What does that mean to me? Who should I be loyal to? And so these are the thought processes that are going on. And we haven't even talked about, of course, the abuse sometimes that
Oh,
has led them to be placed in foster care in the first place, right? And so there are different levels of trauma that they're going through, but it is always present on some level. That's important for us to acknowledge.
you're listening to Tough Conversations brought to you from Fostering Families Today as we discuss how interracial foster and adoptive families can prepare their children to thrive outside of the bubble of their loving families. Our first guest today is adoption educator and trainer Tony Hines from the Center for Adoption Support and Education. Tony, we were just talking about trauma. Can the trauma be healed? Or maybe not healed? Can it be minimized?
I think the trauma can be processed. I think
Mm,
when you talk
what does that
about,
mean? Okay.
no, it's a great question. I think when you talk about healing, right? If I get cut, my wound, if I show I got cut years ago, and if I got cut on my right hand and it was bleeding, I got in a car accident, I broke my right hand.
Ooh.
And I can hold up my right hand today. This is my right hand, everyone, and it's healed. It feels good. I don't have blood coming out of it anymore, right? And so it's actually been able to heal, and I'm still able functionally to use it in the same ways that I was using it before. And that's not true for all physical injuries, but that's kind of how we think about physical injuries healing over time. That's not the case when it comes to trauma. When it comes to trauma, we don't get to places where we literally in our bodies, usually where we feel healed. But what can happen with proper discussion, with therapy, with community support systems, is we can process trauma in healthy ways by one, talking about that trauma, also by making sure that we are acknowledging that we might still feel pain from that trauma, and it's okay sometimes to feel pain from being separated from our birth family, for example. That it's okay to feel pain from growing up in predominantly homogenized, same race, racialized placements that sometimes have made us feel racially isolated. That those things are okay to do. When trauma can be, I don't want to say lessened necessarily, but processed, is with the help, though, of our families, with the help of our families who are acknowledging the trauma that has existed in our lives, and families who are willing to say, we hear you, we know that we can't fix everything, but we are here to support you. We are here to listen. We are here to educate ourselves. And that's something that's going to make us feel like we're not processing that alone. And that feeling is priceless, making sure that we can move in the world as individuals who are supported and feel supported by our families in those ways.
Very interesting points. Acknowledging trauma, seeing trauma, helping children process the trauma. Does the trauma ever, no, I was going to say wane with age, but that you just said it doesn't. It stays with us, even though the injury isn't visible. Ooh, Tony, you're dropping a lot of knowledge on me today. Thanks so very much. I want to ask our other guests to join us, but before we do, I want to let our listeners know that we are looking for the next family to feature on the cover of an upcoming issue of Fostering Families Today. If this sounds interesting to you or someone you know might be interested, we'd love to hear from you. Send us a photo and tell us something about your family in 50 words or less. Send it to info@fosteringmediaconnections.org. It's estimated there are 125,000 domestic adoptions annually here in the US, and at least a quarter of those are transracial adoptions. As we focus today on the intersection of race, foster care, and adoption, here's a question for our listeners. This is the part where you get to weigh in. Are you currently, or have you in the past, parented a child of a different race other than your own? It's a poll question. It's a two-part poll question. Are you currently, or have you in the past, parented a child of a different race than your own? If you have, which of the following things did you do to keep them connected to their race or heritage? Attend or celebrate religious or spiritual events together. Invite the child's family to a hair care or perhaps a medical appointment. Join a foster parent support group or other. Let us know. You fill in the blanks. That's our first question of the day. We've got another coming up. We'll have those numbers for you as soon as they are in. Are the numbers up already? I guess it is. Thanks, Sarah, for putting those up there. Let's see. Overwhelmingly, have you currently, or have you in the past parented a child of a different race than your own? And 65% of our responders said no. And I think leading the pack, or if you have, and those who answered yes, 35%, said it was attending or celebrating religious or spiritual events together. Thanks for your participation. Thanks for answering those. We'll have another one coming up later. Now let's meet our other panelists who are all transracial adoptees, some of whom have spent time in foster care. Before we do that, I want to thank Tony Hines. He's going to stay with us as we meet our panelists, but I want to thank you, Tony, for your insight this morning. Now let's meet the panelists. First up is Matthew Anthony, poet. He's a poet and actor who experienced family separation at a young age. He hosts an adoption abolitionist podcast called Little Did You Know, where he explores displacement and replacement, belonging, and possibilities of identity under colonization. And I want to make a note that all of our panelists today, including Tony Hines, do have websites you can visit. Some of them host their own podcasts, some of them are writers, and we're going to leave that information on our webinar info page so you can check them out afterwards. Matthew, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate your being here.
Thank you for having me.
Next up is Daryl Conquering Bear Crow. He is a proud member of the Oglala Sioux tribe and is an advocate on behalf of Native youth nationwide. He is currently the Native Wellness Coordinator at the Denver Indian Health and Family Services. Daryl, pleasure to have you with us today. Good to see you. Stephanie Euler joins us as well. She is a licensed master social worker and therapist and has served families through Maternal Child Health Network, foster care casework, and through post-adoption support. Stephanie, it's good to see you. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Keith Shirillo is a late discovery adoptee, a loving father, and an accounting professional. He currently serves on the Emerging Leaders Advisory Board of the Center for Adoption Support and Education. And finally, Abby Wiggum joins us. Abby grew up in a multiracial family of adoptees and maintains loving relationships with her adoptive family, but says she also walks in reunion with both her maternal and paternal biological families. Abby is currently a full-time seminary student who desires to see all members of the adoption triad live whole and full lives as individuals and families. Thank you to each of you for joining us for today's tough conversations. You heard Tony and I talk there a minute about interracial or transracial. Raise your hand if it's interracial for you or transracial for you. Transracial. Okay, somebody want to volunteer? Stephanie, why don't you volunteer and tell me why it's transracial for you?
When I think of interracial families, I think of other forms, not just adoption. So transracial has always been something that I've attributed to being an adoptee when we're speaking of it. So that's kind of why I did it. Although I really appreciated Tony's explanation, and I may be changing that.
Anybody else want to join in? Keith, are you raising your hand?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'll definitely add that I appreciate Tony's interpretation of that. And it may be something that I'll be using going forward as well.
Okay. Okay, Abby, I see you. Go ahead, tell me, interracial or transracial? Turn on your microphone.
Okay, there we go. So first of all, I loved the hearing about the research behind the interracial and transracial, like the differences. I hadn't researched that. I choose transracial right now because interracial, to me, there's like a connotation of agency, like I'm entering into an interracial relationship. You know, I want to build an interracial family that like every person has a say in it. And I feel transracial to me just sounds and feels a little bit more like I don't really have agency in that, you know, that decision was kind of made for me to be placed into a family that was of a different race than me. So.
Okay, do I see anyone else shaking their head? Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. For me, if I choose between interracial and transracial, I use transracial, but I'm actually not even the most comfortable with the language transracial as a Black person who is in the state of America, right? Like reckoning with Black history, like we come from other nationalities, so we have been made to become Americans. But when we look at the history, because even when we look at what is happening to Black people in the United States, it is clear we are an other, right? And so I use the term, what I'm most comfortable with, and as I talk to different Black adoptees, I think what we're building amongst ourselves, like we use the term transnational. In similar ways, for me, it's inspired actually by different Indigenous adoptees and looking at ICWA as well, and seeing that, like, from my understanding of the reason for ICWA, you know, that is happening because there is an assault on Indigenous children that is happening. And so there is also an assault now, and always has been historically, an assault on Black children. And so, like, I am not for placement of Black children in white homes because, like, I don't trust the white society that we live in to love the Black body in meaningful ways, because if it did, we wouldn't live in the society we live in now. So I'm most comfortable with transnational, but if I choose between interracial and transracial, I choose transracial.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Anthony. Matthew, I have to get used to, because you change your name in the middle of this process. I have to get used to saying Matthew. At what point, and the question is open to everyone, just open your mics when you want to speak. And I want to encourage you also, if there's a question in the chat box, which you all have access to go ahead and just, you know, let me know there's a question you want to answer and go ahead and do so. The question for all of our panelists, at what point did you become aware that you were different? And I hate the term different, but I'm going to use it just for expediency's sake, that you were different from your family. Go ahead. I see Keith down there shaking your head. So if you want to go ahead and answer, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, at a very young age, I knew I looked very different from my family. I grew up with a family of 6 kids. You know, both my brothers are like 5 inches taller than me. I'm like 3 shades darker than everybody in my family. One thing that's always stuck out is my nose. You know, my nose always looked different than my family.
Some physical differences.
Yes, a lot of physical differences, and even my demeanor. I'm more high energy than everybody in my family. I know that since I was little.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I can weigh in. I would say I always knew I was different. I don't think I ever fully felt immersed. I mean, and I don't think they could, because I am different. I'm different. I'm a different race, come from a different biological family, so my characteristics are different. And even though my family, my parents, my adoptive parents ascribed by the colorblind mindset, it was also something that really, like my skin color and my differences were pointed out. So it kind of was, I just always knew. I felt like there was never a time that I pictured myself as wholly apart and fully apart.
Did you say those differences were pointed out?
Yeah, pointed out in different ways.
I'm glad you went there because we were going to go there. How were they pointed out and by whom?
Extended family, in medical paperwork. It was done in different ways. Making comments about how tan I am in the summertime, or how I wish I could look like that. I have to go to a tanning bed to do that, like stuff like that. It was extended. It was everybody, honestly. It was extended family, strangers, friends.
Now, hold on for a moment, Stephanie. I think that, and maybe it's just me, when someone tells you, I wish I could look like that, that's not really a compliment.
No.
That Tony, is that what we call a microaggression?
Well, I think, there are lots of ways we could define that, but yes, I think that.
That's not a compliment.
Yes.
That's amplifying your differences.
Mm-hmm.
How did your family deal with it when someone did that? And this is one of those teaching moments, because part of our job here is to educate, inform, and engage. How can other families help their children through those moments?
So I can say my parents didn't do anything. I think sometimes they probably weren't even, like, it's not something that they even thought, or it even crossed their mind as something that was not right. Obviously I'm the one being othered in the moment. So but I was a child, so I wasn't aware of speaking up and saying something, and it shouldn't have been my responsibility anyway. But I think parents can address it in the moment and stop the conversation, or remove the child from the situation and educate whoever it is that said that, because it's important that they learn that from the modeling that their parents do at that time, and it's helping prepare them to go into the real world later on when their parents not there to step in. And I also wanted to just say the pointing out my differences was big, because being adopted, I really didn't want to look like different from everybody. I wanted to be within the family. I didn't want to stick out. So when they were pointing these things out, it was making me feel more othered in those moments.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Go ahead, Abby.
So a little bit about my background real quick. 5 out of the 6 members of my family growing up were adopted. So my adoptive mom was adopted, and then there were 4 of us kids in a household. 3 of us were children of color. And so we talked about color difference a lot. I know there was never a time when I didn't know that I was adopted or different, because that was, with my mom being an adoptee, she was very intentional about just educating us and making that a part of normal conversation. But what was interesting about my experience is, even though we talked about our differences and tried to affirm, oh, beautiful skin, beautiful hair, my parents still had a very they wanted us to live in a colorblind society, because they thought that's what was right. Mm-hmm. And so actually, whenever other people would point out our differences, and there would be microaggressions, I would just celebrate it, because we were never educated to not do so. So, I would be told that I'm so exotic looking, that's a really big microaggression. But that's something that I just figured, because all of these people who love me are feeding me these microaggressions as though they're compliments. I'm actually internalizing all of them as something that's supposed to be good, but feels really weird. And it wasn't until, later in life when I realized, oh, wait, all of that was racist. All of that was wrong and othering. And so it kind of has made this weird, complex and internal reality for me. So I would just say for parents, it is important that you have these conversations, and that, yes, talking about differences is a good thing, but not in the form of microaggressions. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, talking about internalizing. How has these microaggressions, which we all experience from whether it's family or outsiders or the person in line or in front of you at Kroger's, we all experience microaggressions in some form or fashion daily. How has this experience in your adoptive experience, the microaggression, how has that shaped your perspective on dealing with the world at large? And what are the lessons that resource families, adoptive families can take away from your experiences? Open your mics when you're ready to talk.
Yeah, so for me, like I take notes from Ibram X. Kendi. He talks about how he doesn't call them microaggressions anymore because that's not a clear enough word to describe what's happening. What's happening is it's abuse, and it's an racial abuse. No matter how small it is, it's a racist abuse that is happening. And when we use terms like microaggression, what that's doing is it's helping white bodies be really comfortable with us as non-white bodies saying we're experiencing racist abuse. Right? That's what's happening is we're normalizing language that makes white people comfortable with us saying we're being
So
abused
we're
every day.
minimizing. We're
Right.
minimizing.
Right. So I don't say microaggression, I say racist abuse. And when I do that, that's changed the fabric of the conversations and relationships that I have in my life, because now we ain't talking about, hey, you tried to touch my hair and that was a microaggression, and oh, what is a microaggression? I'm saying, hey, you doing this with my hair, that's racist abuse. You only doing this because, you know, we're on different grounds to talk about, because the Black body should not be used in certain ways that the white body tries to use it in, right? And so,
let me ask this question, Matthew. Who among you has had the hair thing? Anybody among you have had the hair thing? And let me explain to our listeners and readers what I mean by that. That is someone who doesn't love you, stranger or family, touching your hair and then commenting on its texture, whether it's straight or curly, or one word which I just find horrific is nappy. Hair is not nappy. Hair is either curly or it's not. And it is, if we don't know, it's offensive to touch someone's hair, just as it would be as offensive to walk up and run your hands along someone's skin. Another teaching moment. There are offensive gestures, which, as Matthew pointed out, they're not microaggressions, they're assaults against your dignity, no matter how old or how young you are. Did anyone's parents ever have the race conversation with them? Anyone?
Well, nobody ever had a race conversation with me, but they sure did, you know, portray racism towards me. And actually, since you're bringing up the hair thing, there were times where I'd put gel in my hair, go like that, real curly, and then somebody in my family would say, "You look like a goddamn Puerto Rican." Well, I am. And then also, I would hear lots of jokes about, like, what do you call somebody that doesn't know if they're white or black? Puerto Rican. Like, I would, you know, these are the types of things I dealt with growing up. Well, I guess I should add now that I didn't know I was adopted till 10 years ago, till I was 33 years old. So I was dealing with all this stuff my whole life. And I didn't know that I actually was what they were being racist against.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very important point, Keith, and I'm glad you brought that up. You know, I started asking if your parents had the race conversation with you, but it brings to mind something else. Have your adoptive families spoken in a negative or condescending or harmful way about your race of origin? I'm seeing some head shaking. I'm seeing some head shaking. Who wants to? Daryl, I haven't heard from you. Would you like to share your experiences?
Yeah, I'm just here listening to everybody, and my indigenous, we're here sitting here on Toro Island, so I want to say the land acknowledgement of the Cheyenne and Oglala Lakota people that I'm on right now. My ancestors and the 7 generations to come, man, this is a topic that is crazy to talk about, because white people have been coming in, adopting and taking our kids for the better of kill the Indian, save the child. And it's still going on. I knew there were a point 10 years ago, we stopped adopting Russian children. Like no Russian kids were ever adopted. So why are we now going to Native kids and other kids to adopt them out? And I want to question our non-BIPOC people out there is, why do you adopt colored children? Like, why do you adopt Native children and want to change their identity? Want to be able to cut their hair when we go through ceremonies and we go through things that we cut our hair for those purposes. We, in the language, don't talk to a kid and say, hey, chief, what do you want for dinner? Let's go have a powwow. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, and it reminds me of just a movie that's out there, Instant Family, where they go out there and try to find a home and foster kids or adopt kids. And let me tell you before I end, is like all Native kids go back to where they come from, whether they get adopted or not. My brothers and sisters were adopted and they go home to their homelands and they're like, why weren't we able to attend ceremony in this? And it's because in the land mindset we're in with the Pope and everything is that it's witchcraft. Ceremony, sage, using traditional medicine is taught as witchcraft in the white people's eyes. And so I may be energized and really amped about this, but when we looked at the history, white people have come into our land, Turtle Island, and have really taken us down. And that's why we have the Indian Child Welfare Act 42 years ago, but we still don't follow it. And so cutting of the hair, wanting to change the names, wanting to not educate who they come from. When they turn 18 or when they're 10 years past 18, they go home and they're like, why wasn't I ever told who I am? Mm-hmm. And so I know when I was in that realm of area, I'm Native, and that's who I'm going to be. I can be in a white Native foster home, but I'm always going to be Native American.
Daryl brings up a very interesting point that I want to raise with Tony, and that is intentional racism and negligent racism. And explain that. And Tony, weigh in on this one for me.
Sure. And very quickly, I wanted to go back to some of what Daryl said there as well, because we had the Indian Child Welfare Act, which he's referring to, which literally this was not a private agency. This was a government-sponsored act that stipulated that we were going to go into homes, the reservations of Indigenous children and families, and take Indigenous children out of their communities and place them in white families. And it was literally stated in a quote from the Bureau of Indian Affairs at that particular time in 1958 that Indian children, the language I'm using is the language that they used at that time, Indian children would be better served by growing up in white households than remaining on reservations where they have less chance at survival and a good life. That was literally that was the terminology that was used during this time. And that's relevant because it took over 20 years for ICWA to be passed after the Indian Adoption Project was put in place. It took until 1978 for ICWA to be passed, and ICWA was passed after not only pushback, but uproar from the Indigenous community. And stories upon stories upon stories about Indigenous children growing up in white adoptive households where, like Daryl was saying, that their hair was cut, where they were taught to abandon their languages of origin, where they were taught to abandon their birth families. So we, back to your point, would call that now today intentional racism. Back then, they would have called that negligent racism because they would have said, well, we were just trying to create a better life for them in any way, shape, or form. So when we think about what negligent racism means, what intentional racism means, what we're trying to help you understand is that no matter what terminology you want to use, it has the same impact. It has the same effect on our kids, on our identities, on not only our families, but someone stated earlier, intergenerationally. The Indian Adoption Project had intergenerational impacts. What you're witnessing happening has intergenerational impacts. In 25 years from now, we'll look at some of the things that we're talking about today that some of you may be thinking, well, those are microaggressions, to Matthew's point, or those are negligent. We will think of those as intentional things. So whatever terminology you want to use for this, just know that it's equally harmful. And when we speak to people, we can still help them say, look, I understand that when you were saying that my son is so articulate, that you might have been well-meaning. However, this was actually something that was detrimental to him. This was detrimental because you were not treating the other kids who are just as articulate as he is, that are not Black, that same way that you are speaking to him. And he's going to maybe think about that later and think to himself, well, maybe they didn't expect me to be articulate. Maybe they don't expect people like me to be articulate. So we need to approach these conversations, especially with family members, with empathy, but with standing firm in the same ways that we've heard our panelists talk about standing firm as far as the impact on identities and all the considerations that that has for our families.
We talked earlier about raising children in a, race-blind society without considering race or ethnicity or culture, or Tony, is that even possible until we overcome the hurdle of negligent racism?
Well, I think we shouldn't want it to be possible.
Mm-hmm.
We shouldn't want our kids to be growing up in colorblind societies. Why? It's great to celebrate our uniqueness from each other. I love being Black. I love it. I love being someone who grew up in the DC area, because that's where I grew up. I wouldn't want someone to come and tell me, you didn't really grow up in DC, you grew up in the world. We are geographically blind. Why would we want to do that? We have uniqueness, we have shared histories that are still important, that are always going to be important for us to talk about and to discuss. And in doing that, it's really integral for our families to comprehend that when you're speaking about race, for that reason, to include your own cultural identities when having those discussions. Your children, your prospective children, shouldn't be the only ones in the household that are expected to learn about their race. You see my last name on the screen there is Hines, because that's the last name of my adopted family. Mm-hmm. And while I identify as a Black person first and foremost, I recognize that I grew up in this kind of bicultural upbringing, and I do have pride in my last name. And that's because my parent, who has this last name, was really made it a point to talk about her Irish ancestry and how great she felt about that, and to practice certain things in the household related to that ancestry. And so I look forward then, when I have children, to talking to them about my last name and our family last name. And that's not colorblind, right? That's not ethnically blind to do. And it doesn't need to be, and it shouldn't be.
Let's take a break real quick and tell our listeners that you're listening to Tough Conversations, brought to you from Fostering Families Today, as we discuss how interracial foster and adoptive families can prepare their children to thrive outside of the bubble of their loving families. Let's take our second poll question of the day. This one's an easy one. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the easiest and 5 being the hardest, how difficult was it for you to access cultural resources in your child's community of origin? Take a moment and answer that, and then Sarah will put that information back up on the screen once we get a count. I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. You've taught me a lot, and I think every day we should learn something new. So I appreciate what you've shared with me today. I also want to invite those of you who are watching to sign in, weigh in with your comments or questions in our chat feature, and we will try to answer as many as we can. let's see. Let's go to the chat. This one comes from Olivia Alston and says, good afternoon from Atlanta. I am working hard to introduce the Black church to our ministry in Atlanta proper and the urban care. Olivia, I wish you had told me a little bit more about how that intersects with the lives of children in foster and adoptive families. That would give me a little bit more background. Then we've got Robin Lasota. She is with us from Illinois. She's leading a study on improving supports for interracial foster families in Illinois. Thanks, Robin, for that. I want to talk about, do we have those numbers yet up on the poll, or are we still voting? Okay, we'll get back to that. Oh, here we go. Thanks so very much. So on a scale of 1 to 5, number 3 being, I guess that's sort of in the middle, how difficult or how easy was it to access cultural resources in your children's community of origin? I see Daryl smiling on that one. What's on your mind, Daryl? Did you want to respond to that comment, to those poll answers?
Yeah, I find it that when it comes to indigenous culture, the first thing people say is like, I don't know, like I haven't done my research. Like in the chat, it's just right there. Like, I don't know. It's a simple Googling of like Native American resources in my state. It's not that hard. I know that we tend to come to these webinars or come to panels and want their resources or want them to share their experiences, when all in all reality is that it's the work that we got to do. You've got the money to adopt. You got the money to do all this. Now let's go out there and Google. Let's do something in connecting these cultures together.
Yeah, if you can't find it on Google, it probably doesn't exist. When we talk about telling families or informing potential adoptive families who are considering adopting or fostering a child of another race, what would you say, this is open for everyone, what recommendations would you give to someone who's checking that box that says open to a child of any race? Weigh in when you want to.
Well, I'll just say that if it comes to the point where someone of a different race does enter your family through adoption, make sure that you embrace who they are, because we can't escape who we are. These features have never left me my whole life. I've always had them and always will. And the world outside sees it. Yeah. Even if there was a time when I didn't know it. So just embrace that. Embrace who they are.
Daryl said, Google it. If you don't know, Google it.
I think if we can be real about like race and like how violent it, like if they're going to be choosing, like if these adopters are going to say that they are open to children of any race, like what is the construct of race? It's a violent conquering tool, right? And so that's what white supremacy is. And so I was in Ferguson. Mike Brown gets killed. I'm in those protests in Ferguson, October. I get choked out on the front lines. There's a picture of it. Cornel West is in that picture, right? Handing me my glasses that fell off. I get back home to my adopter's home in Wisconsin. I'm processing this with her because I'm like, ooh, do I sue the department? Because this time the movement, we're in the streets because we need to indict Darren Wilson, right? Yeah. That's what it is. And so I'm like, do I sue the department? Like, what do I do? And my adopter says to me, who's a white woman, what if there's a race war? Whose side do I choose? And that sounds like a wild question, but let's be real. What is 2020? What are those protests? It's not just for George Floyd that we want justice, it's for all Black people. So are these white people who are going to adopt Black people, are they going to be for Black liberation? Because we live in a white supremacist state that is killing Black people, which is dispossessing, displacing us at everything, whether it's education, whether it's sending us to prisons, whether like housing, like every single thing imaginable. This country is destroying us. So to the white adopters, do you care beyond just being able to call us your son and then being able to braid our hair? Like I hear a lot of white adopters when they have Black kids, they talk about, oh, what do I do with their hair and their culture and I don't care if you can braid their hair. We live in America, which is trying to kill Black people. That's why I don't think white people should be adopting Black people, because they straight are not about it. They are not trying to save us. In 1972, the National Association of Black Social Workers put out a position statement on transracial adoption, black, white, and they said, no,
No, yeah.
this should not happen. And I agree.
I'm glad you mentioned hair. Show of hands, how many of you saw Colin Kaepernick's movie? Good. Stephanie, did you get a chance to see it as well? The scene where his parents take him to Supercuts. I nearly fell out my chair. I nearly fell out my chair when I saw that. And it's not funny, it's sad because his parents did not recognize that he was. And for those who aren't familiar with the legacy of the Black barber shop in the African American community, it serves as more than just a place to get your hair cut. It serves as sort of the link in the community between, it's that meeting place. In some places, except, I'm sorry, but some places it's not safe. More recently a shooting, but that aside, it is that meeting place where people of different opinions can come together and experience one another and share what's going on. It's sort of that LinkedIn African American style. And when they took him to the Supercuts to get his hair, it was clear to me that his parents didn't understand the importance of the cultural reference of the Black barbershop. And it's the same thing for women getting their hair done as well. You know, recently I saw one family, instead of getting their daughter's hair done, they simply cut her hair off. That's not a solution. You don't cut a child's hair off. So in the movie, to get back to the movie, the mother asked someone, Daryl said, Google, is it as simply, Keith said, Daryl and Keith said, Google it. Is it as simply as asking someone? Can we do that? Can we tell parents that it's okay to ask someone how to do your child's hair or how to fix your child's favorite food? Can we go there? Abby, let me hear from you. I see Stephanie shaking her head no.
Can you repeat the question for me one more time?
Yeah, is it as simple as in the movie with Colin Kaepernick, when his mother doesn't know what to do with his hair, and she asks a coworker? Well, I have problems with that scene in and of itself, but is it that simple that we can simply ask someone? Daryl and Keith said, Google it if you don't know, and you're shaking your head no. Abby.
I never said Google it. I never said that.
Oh, you didn't say Google it. Okay.
I never said that.
Okay. Is it as simple as just ask someone? Abby?
No,
No.
absolutely not. No, my mom, she tried really hard, and she asked some people, and she tried to make like hair grease, and she'd like really put forth effort, right, at times to take care of my hair or my siblings' hair, and she would ask different members of the Black community. But it's not enough, you know? I mean, I guess you have to ask questions, right? Like you can Google, but no, that's not, it goes way beyond that in order to raise like an actual Black person or an actual child according to their ethnic heritage, you know?
Yeah. Stephanie, I see you shaking your head.
I agree with Abby. I think Google is, you know, it's a resource. It can actually connect you to communities. I mean, you can look up a place to go. I don't think Google should be the only avenue you take to learn about your child and how to do their hair and things like that. I think it goes back to like the racial mirrors, which I don't think we talked about, but there's so much
the racial
mirrors.
Oh, yes, thank you.
So there's so much more to hair care than just hair care. It's a cultural experience.
Yeah.
I would also say,
unless you've had it fried, dyed, and laid to the side. Okay, go ahead, Abby.
Yeah, I was gonna say, kind of tying multiple questions together. For white parents who are adopting Black kids or who are open to adopting children of color, I would say it's so important for you to be able to interrogate your own whiteness, because that it impacts everything, but like even the little things like hair. Like I remember family members of mine trying to get me to embrace my curly hair and embrace my blackness, but they did so from a place of really anti-blackness. They said, hey, you don't want to be like one of those girls, like one of those Black people who want to look white. You know, it was more from a place of don't be like the Black people, as opposed to, hey, you are absolutely beautiful and like embrace it all. Like we're going all in. So I would just say, kind of tying the hair part back into the what would we tell white parents who are open to adopting children of color, that they should be willing to interrogate their own whiteness, the ways that they have internalized white supremacy and the ways that they perpetuate anti-Blackness, because it shows up in every part of life. And so they've got to be willing to interrogate it and like do away with it. So
I'm glad you brought that up. That how many, show of hands, have heard that comment? Don't be like those other. Really, everyone. Okay. Keith, you want to tell me what happened?
Oh yeah, sure. Anytime I would like interact with somebody of a different race, you know, even my ex-wife was a different race, or like just friends I had, you know, or like even when I found my biological family on the Puerto Rican side, it was always about the race thing was always brought up about them. You know, it's just like odd, you know. I just still find it very odd. And yeah, they were definitely trying to like, you know, make me think a certain way, even though I've always thought my own way anyway. Yeah.
Let's take a quick break because we're coming up on the top of the hour, and this is when we usually end. So if anyone has to leave, just let me know. Maybe we'll stick around for another 15 or 20 minutes. Because I really think this is an important conversation, and Daryl's shaking his head in agreement. I frankly think we could go on for hours and hours. You're all welcome to join me at home and sit around and have coffee, and we can talk about it. We won't solve anything, but we can talk about it. So to our listeners, you're listening to Tough Conversations, brought to you by Fostering Families Today, as we discuss how interracial foster and adoptive families can prepare their children to thrive outside of the bubble of their families. If we can even do that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we can do that. I'm not sure if we can adequately, as Tony said, prepare children who have been traumatized, Tony tells us, in utero from that point forward, the trauma compounds itself. I hope I'm using the correct words. I'm not a social worker, but I think that's what Tony was saying. So if you have to leave us, thank you for being with us today. This is an important conversation as we look ahead to 2023. We are looking to hear from our readers, from our listeners. We're preparing webinars. It's July. We're preparing webinars for 2023. We want to hear from you. What is it? What resources, what information do you want to know as we sit down in the coming weeks and plan our calendar of webinars for 2023. I also want to invite our listeners, our panelists, anyone who's with us today. We're always looking for writers. If there's something going on with your agency or in your community, drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. Help us help you. That's what we're here for, to inform, educate, and engage. You can find us at info, drop your information at info@fosteringfamiliestoday.com. How many of you have heard the phrase, love is enough, or I don't see color? Show of hands. Abby is shaking her head. Daryl's shaking his, everybody's shaking their head today. Is love, show of hands, is love enough? I see some heads shaking, and I don't see color. How do you feel about that statement? Stephanie, let me start with you.
Well, the first thing I always think of is if you don't see color, you don't see me. So, because I'm not white.
Okay, Daryl's, okay, you want to weigh in on that, Daryl?
I was just giving snaps, and I also want to bring a point to this. Like you're attacking my brother Matthew here, and it's not. We're not attacking white people. We're not coming with hostility,
I
but
wanted
it's
to
our
say that. I was
experiences,
going to say that.
and that we, yeah, you may be this loving family of this couple, but our experiences and what we've seen and what we've gone through are those conversations. These are tough conversations. And again, if this is really daggering you in your heart and you really are having this issue of like, wow, they're racist, that is not what we're doing. That's not who we are. And our experiences of what we've gone through in the current climate that we're in makes us feel that way. And so how do we make sure in 7 generations from here that we don't have this same conversation, that we're comfortable in a room?
That we don't have to have this conversation again. That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up, Daryl, because it's something I wanted to say. The point of this is not to attack anyone or to isolate anyone. The point of today's webinar is we have a room full of people who have similar experiences, and we want our listeners, our readers to know what and put into practice in your own home. No one's being attacked, and my sincere apologies if it's coming across that way, because that's not our intention. That is definitely not our intention. Stephanie, you brought up something earlier. I think it's important to go back to, and that is the topic of mirrors. How do we see ourselves versus how does the rest of the world see ourselves? And how does that inform how the rest of the world treats us? Anybody want to weigh in on that? Stephanie, you want to go take the lead on that?
Well, when I was talking about racial mirrors, I was talking more about, having your child around people who look like them, having different things, movies, social media, books, going to communities that mirror them, taking them to cultural spaces where they can see themselves mirrored back at them. That was more of what I was talking about earlier.
Okay, I appreciate that.
So, and I just think that's really important. I mean, it's when you're surrounded by people who don't look like you, you start to think sometimes something might be wrong with you, because it's not like you're seeing people in these spaces who are successful that look like you. I don't know. For me, it was very difficult because I couldn't be everybody else. And there was nobody around me that I could say, I want to be like them and see myself rising up in the same way that looked like me. It was just, everybody was white. It was a completely white space. White books, white toys, social media, or not social media, media, movies and things like that. So something as simple as a picture book, like I don't even think you said earlier I was a caseworker. I'm also a therapist. So I specialize in post-adoption. I specialize in transracial adoption. And one of the things I've done is have books around the office with some of my younger clients who it was like the first time they ever opened a book and saw just Black people who looked like them in the pages.
As a child, before you became a therapist, how did that inform how you felt about yourself?
I mean, I felt erased. There was nothing around me that mirrored me.
Erased. Say that word again. You said erased?
Erased. I just felt like I was not a part of any of these pictures, not just in the book, but like the picture of my life. Like I was just, my culture, my race was not there.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Go ahead, Keith.
I guess this might go along with the mirroring, all that stuff. Anytime I've met somebody of Latin descent, even growing up, and like they would automatically assume that I spoke Spanish. And when I would speak back English and like I didn't know any Spanish or anything, or sometimes I was met with a little bit of hostility, or I've even been told that like people thought that I was being a snob, not speaking Spanish back. And then, well, later when I discovered I was adopted and of my true nationality, I've been able to better explain that to people. But yeah, it's almost like, the mirroring of like how society views me versus what I assumed about what I was taught about myself. But it's been very freeing to know my true self now. And I've embraced it. Even at my job, that I've been there 19 years, but when I discovered I was adopted 10 years ago, I told them to change my initial application to put Latin on, Latino on there so I can embrace my true self.
How did that inform how you felt about church itself as a child?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just like I said, the blatant racism that I've dealt with in the home and outside of the home definitely had effects on me. And I think it was meant for me to almost hate my own race. I think that's what they were trying to do. But I'm just thankful that God had equipped me with the compassion to not fall into that. That's all I can say.
Let's respond to a comment in the chat room, which I just lost because I have a new computer. Okay, here we go. Sandra Hernandez writes, removal is itself a traumatic. Removal itself is traumatic. Imagine being adopted. Believe all children that have been removed should get counseling. Had one case that went to adoption. Foster parent adopted all 3 siblings and let them keep their last names. Interesting. Brings me to a question. How many of you have had therapy? Okay, everyone. How important was, let's start with Daryl. How important was therapy to your well-being?
Therapy wasn't part of my well-being because it was a white therapist, and that therapist really didn't know the cultural understanding of what I needed when I needed a medicine man or when I want to smudge or any of our cultural medicines. They were teaching me the Western colonization way of healing, which when I left out of care, that was totally, it just back-ended everything that I was taught when I was younger.
Matthew, your experiences.
Please restate the question. I was in the chat.
No, okay. Well, share the chat with us.
Yeah, so Francesca, let me scroll up to get her last name. Francesca, how do you
Okay, you want to
well, Francesca said, my understanding is that one of the goals of ICWA was to address the historical racism involved in the removal of Indigenous children. My question is, should this be the policy for all BIPOC children? Again, I ask as someone appointed by the courts to advocate for the best interest of children, because what I am hearing today is that it really is not ever in the best interest of the child to place them permanently in a family that does not reflect their history and culture and socially constructed race. Asking you all because I really believe that you have the firsthand knowledge.
What's the question? What's the question she had?
The question is, should this policy, being ICWA, the Indigenous Children Welfare Act, should that policy be for all BIPOC children? Basically, should we not allow any BIPOC children to be adopted by white people? Should we be inspired in the solidarity and understanding of whiteness in the ways that Indigenous people are and have been forced to be historically, and as we imagine healing?
Okay.
I want to respond to that exactly from Matthew, because I think it's important to continue to discuss ICWA and what it is and what it means, because ICWA technically does allow for white parents to adopt Indigenous children, but it says that before you can adopt an Indigenous child, before you can adopt a child who has tribal membership, you have to reach out to the birth family to make sure that no one in the birth family is able to adopt that child. You have to make sure cultural traditions are honored, and you have to get permission from that tribe to adopt this child. So after you've done all of that, if you've kind of done all of that work and you're still at a place where you're able to adopt a child, given all the things that you've done, then you can adopt that child. So I think when it comes to thinking about what would a Black ICWA look like, what would any other race of ICWA for other racial groups look like, it would come to this idea of doing a lot more work around making sure that those same measures are not only thought about, but exhausted before that child is going to be adopted by a family outside of that child's community background, if we were applying ICWA to other communities. And we are not doing that right now in practice. Right now, if you look at the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act stipulates that if you're an adoptive parent of any race, you can't be turned away on the basis of the color of your skin. If you're a white parent and you want to adopt a Black child, you can't have an agency tell you you can't adopt this child because you're white and we're only doing same race placements for this child. However, what's important to state in the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, in that same law, it also stipulates that birth parents are not allowed to have a preference racially for the family that their child is going to be adopted by, but the adopted family is able to have a racialized preference when it comes to the child that they would like to adopt. So some of you may have gotten a form that may have said, would you basically mind adopting a child of a different race, or what child racially would you prefer to adopt, is on other forms, both past and still present in some agencies. So when we look at kind of the discrepancies and who's holding the power in that situation, we're looking at an overrepresentation of children of color in the foster care system whose families are not able to choose the race of family that their children are going to. But when it comes to an adopted family, overemphasis on, or not overemphasis, who are predominantly going to be families who are white families adopting, because that's what the statistics tell us, they are able to have a racialized preference. So is that in line with an ICWA? No, it's not. No, it's not. So when we think about even what it looks like to have equity in our system, I think it's important to think about these mechanisms policy-wise that are currently in place that aren't allowing for equity to really be in place in the child welfare system.
We are coming
Tony,
up.
thank you for responding, but as I was finishing reading that question, I was actually wondering if I could have asked Daryl to respond to it, given that ICWA affects his people, not mine or ours.
Okay, hold on. We're coming up on 11:15. As I said before, I think this conversation could go on and on. I know we've lost quite a few people because of the time, but how many of you are able to hang in till 11:30? Show of hands. Okay, I see a couple of you have to go. If you do, before you go, just let me thank you. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for sharing your stories. I always invite people to the webinars and promise that this will be a safe place for you to express your opinions, because that's what matters. And I hope that I've given you that. If you have to go, thank you very much for being with us today. I've got a couple more questions I think that need to be answered. And I want you to share your experiences. Before we get to that, Daryl, if you want to, the floor is open to you if you want to respond to the question that Matthew and Tony responded to just a moment ago.
Yeah, I just want to say that this case right now that is in the Supreme Court, Yekwa versus Branke, is huge. This isn't about the Indian Child Welfare Act. This isn't about children. This is about tribal sovereignty. And this is about big gains on the oil industry because of what had just passed in Oklahoma of stripping rights of sovereignty in there. And so when we're saying, oh, this is about Indian child welfare, it really isn't. There's another agenda for that. But coming back full circle to this, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the reason for that is because of me. I'm a failed ICWA case. I went through tons of group homes and foster homes, losing my cultural identity. I didn't get to get the marks of going to Sundance. I didn't get the opportunity to get my Indian name in a naming ceremony. And so the Indian Child Welfare Act is the prevention for that. And so when I say 7 generations ahead, we don't want to talk about foster care. We don't ever want to have this discussion. But because in the moccasins that I am now, we have to have these tough conversations. And so let's pray. Let's hope that in 2023 that we still have the Indian Child Welfare Act protecting us. And I want to backtrack to a question that they had, like, why is it so hard for BIPOC families to become foster homes, to become adoptive homes? There's so many strict guidelines that Western colonization people have decided to come about. When they were in a room, there was no BIPOC conversations. We were on the outside of that circle. Here's our circle. We're sitting on the outside, just as foster and adoptive kids. We're on the outside while people in this circle is making decisions for us. And so when we move ahead, when we move generations ahead, let's have those people in those rooms. Let's have those conversations with those young people with lived experience in the rooms. And so that's the challenge. Jill is going to Minnesota, and I hope you had youth engagement and lived experience in those conversations. Again, ICWA is not race-based. It is not a race-based. It is because of all the removal that was going on with children, the generations behind me. And now we're just working for generations ahead of us to be better, and that we do have full circle for our kids that are going to be adopted or in foster care. We do have customary adoptions that are working way better than just having closed adoptions.
Daryl, you mentioned you've been in a ton of foster homes. How many is a ton?
To me, it's five or more is a ton. And that's not just my story, but that's a lot of people's stories, because we go in as teenagers and not a lot of people want us. And so they put us in different group homes. Some of us end up in jail where we're treated as criminals because there's no group homes that want us. And so that's a whole nother discussion.
That's a whole other webinar for another day. You're talking about 2023 already.
Yeah.
I rarely share my story, but I'll share this one thing. I was in foster care for a very long time. One thing I heard in foster care was I wasn't family. I wasn't really part of the family. I was that other child. How many of you heard something similar? Oh, just my experience. Okay. Well, then let me tell you, please don't tell your child they're not part of the family. It has a profound effect on a child's psyche as they grow. I'm glad that no one else had to hear that when they were growing up. But I want to know, how many of you attended a predominantly white school? Show of hands. Ever experience intentional or negligent racism from staff, teachers? Not classmates, because kids will say anything. But what about teachers or administrators? Show of hands. You want to tell me how your parents addressed that when you got home?
Well, I mean, I didn't know it until later that it was even wrong. Like, until as an adult, like you look back, I wasn't even prepared to go in and know that this was racism against me until I was an adult, and now I'm looking back.
Ah, okay. So you didn't even know what was going on. Okay. What about your experience, Abby? When you
were I would say I didn't really know either. I think a lot of, my school wanted me. I was a really good basketball player, and so they used actually like my body type and some assumptions about my ability and about my desire to succeed on the court based on race, when that really, wasn't the case for me. I really wanted to go to a public school because I wanted to be around people, and so I didn't really have language for any of this. As conversations were had, like while I was in the room and conversations were had about me and about my body and about my athleticism, I didn't know, I knew it felt wrong, but I didn't know how to make the connections. Also, I did have one teacher, one tutor. I went to like a classical school, so we had tutors. He told me specifically that he thought that I and my family were like, that we were cursed, because I was having a hard time in school. I was struggling with depression, and I really wanted to transfer to a different school. So I came to him early one morning when I was asking for help, and that was his response to me was, well, no, you need to persevere. That's what Jesus would do. And I think you're struggling because you're cursed. So you tapping out now wouldn't help anything. And so I don't even know that he thought, he said that. And he was talking too about like my older sister and my mom like had some health problems. So he's referring to like my family unit, but he knew that that they were adopted too, even though my older sister was white. I still think, it reflects like a eugenics, right? And how that is intertwined with adoption and how that's intertwined with white supremacist views and just the way we kind of navigate the world and the way that adoptees in general are kind of ostracized. So yeah, those were a couple of my experiences.
As we get ready to close out at the bottom of the hour, I have a couple of questions I want to go back to Tony with. for a moment. Let's see. We're talking about adoption today. I mean, everyone here, almost to a person, is spent a little bit of time in foster care. And I want to ensure that our listeners know that what we're talking about today can be applicable to what's going on in foster families as well, with children that you're fostering. So some of the issues that you've heard come up, am I right, Tony, are issues that need to be addressed in the foster care. I don't want to seem like we're beating up on anybody. But am I right, Tony? This is what's going on? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
I mean, these issues are going on in foster care. They're going on in, as I think I heard Stephanie mention earlier, in relation to interracial families that are not
Yes.
interracial adoptive families. These are still issues present in those households. So I think someone earlier had stated something in relation to having some type of issue with what Matthew was saying in reference to white families adopting children of color. And to anyone that is thinking about some of these issues and these challenges, I would just ask you to think about not perhaps literally where your brain goes to when you hear things like that, but why someone might be saying something like that in the first place. We have lots of evidence, empirically based evidence, to show us that we have not done adoption generally. Just take away even race for a moment. We have not done adoption generally. We have not done foster care generally in the ways that are in the best interest of the child. We traditionally have not done interracial adoption, interracial fostering in ways that are also in the best interest of the child. And so when we talk about some of those impacts, that's why language is being used there, because we've seen what has happened when the best interests of the child have not been at play. And so, yes, to answer your question, these are things that are commonplace among foster families too.
I was surprised to hear this, and I'm not sure where I got this from. I understand that some adult interracial adoptees part ways with their adoptive families, and who often don't find that the relationship becomes strained. I was surprised to hear that. Can someone explain, is that true? And is it inevitable? Does that happen? Anyone have experience with that? And can you offer words of advice to parents as they prepare for their children to transition into those adult years? Just open your mics when you're ready to talk.
I haven't experienced this directly, but I've seen a lot of friends deal with it, and a lot of it has to do with like what's going on in politics, and the closed-mindedness of a lot of people, in people's families, and yeah, it's deep stuff though. It's probably a whole nother webinar, I'm sure, too.
A whole nother, well, send us those ideas to our listeners and to our participants also. Let's do a round robin. Let's start with Keith, and well, let's do it alphabetically. Who's alphabetically? Abby's first. Okay. Words of advice for foster or adoptive families who are considering adopting or fostering a child of a different race. Abby?
I would say two things. I would say, number one, interrogate your own white, like be willing to interrogate your own whiteness. If you're not willing to look at race and racism from a systemic level, you're not ready to adopt a child. Like, you should not be adopting a child. So I would say that, be willing and ready to look at racism from a societal level and interrogate how that impacts you as a person. Secondly, I would say one thing my parents did, they did such a good job of this, is they actually, I heard them say multiple times that I'm not theirs, but it wasn't in a bad way. That it was, Abby, belong to God. It was this a beautiful surrender, I would say. And it was, yes, according to our faith as like a Christian family, but I would just say have open hands with your adoptee, and let them know like that you're going to love them as your own, but whatever they choose later on, if they want to reunite with their family, if they want to go a different direction, like that they're free to do so. Because my parents gave me the liberty to choose to reunite with my family, and to choose anything I wanted, like that has actually enhanced my relationship with them and my affections for them now as an adult. Because I have always known that they have valued me as kind of autonomous, from their like identity. So anyways.
Daryl, words of advice.
I would say be kind, be open-minded, and definitely understand that the times that we're living in, that our children are going to be asked questions about who, what, where they're from, and know that there's local cultural resources centers in every city, in every state, and every national website that are out there. And for those that have Native kids, Indigenous kids, connect them to a song, find them a heartbeat, a dance beat, or something that are out there. And always, everyone's saying I'm here for the best interest of the child.
Mm-hmm.
But the best interest of that child is asking them. Are we not asking them what they want? What do you want? What do you want to see? We're far too much, I'm adopting this kid, it's my kid, my values. But again, at the end of the day, when we turn 18 or when we turn 29, 30, we ask questions and we want to go home. So be kind to be open-minded.
Thank you. Keith?
Oh yeah, so well, I mean, I would always say, if you're going to adopt a child, make sure that's absolutely the last resort for that family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, don't just adopt a child because you want a child in your home. I mean, that's first and foremost. And then second of all, yeah, just try to learn as much about their history and so they can know about themselves. I mean, there are things I learned about my biological family that would have helped me throughout life. Like my grandparents on my biological father's side were Holocaust survivors. I mean, that would have been tremendous confidence builder for me. And it would have also let me know certain things about, biology and their effects because of things that they went through, the trauma, generational trauma. Yeah, just learn as much as you can about the child if that's the last resort that they're relinquished and adopted eventually. Yeah.
Thank you. Matthew, final word.
Final word. Yeah, I think when we're thinking about
Yeah.
when we're thinking about childcare, I think we need to be thinking about healing, especially in this very traumatizing world for the Black body. For the Black body, is what I'm talking about, right? It's traumatizing, and so, what kind of audacity do white bodies have to assume that they can have healing spaces for Black bodies? And that's a real question that they need to sit with, and they don't want to. But like, if you can't be a healing space for a Black body, like, stop. So that's what I think.
Stephanie, piece of advice for prospective adoptive or foster parents.
I would echo what everybody said, and then just, remain a lifelong learner when it comes to this stuff. And don't ever get comfortable in the fact that you don't know everything. Like you don't know it all, and you can always learn. And just to remain open, don't take things personally with your adopted child, and understand that this is a lifelong impact. Like they're gonna have experiences from birth until they're in their old age, and it's important to be a support the entire time.
Okay, final word goes to Tony Hines.
Everyone has really said a lot of what you need to be doing, what you should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
I would add acknowledging racism onto that. If you as a parent are willing to talk about race but not acknowledge racism, then you're doing your child a disservice. What I see most often is that parents feel as though they don't need to talk about race or racism until their kid hits 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. and now their interracially adopted child is having negative experiences related to the color of their skin, related to racism that is coming upon them based upon the color of their skin. And now parents want advice. Now they want support. It's not too late at that particular point in time, but it would have been much better if parents had been having those conversations developmentally as their children were moving into those spaces. And the same thing is true for us as adults. I highly doubt that any of us on this panel feel comfortable having conversations surrounding race and these deep conversations surrounding race with we have white adoptive parents. And that's because of our history being raised by parents maybe who have been uncomfortable because they feel as though they're not well equipped, or they don't want to, or they want to pass it on. You are their parents, and you need to own that fact. And part of owning that is being comfortable, getting uncomfortable, and putting yourself in positions and places and mental spaces in your head where you can really begin to understand more of what your children may be going through.
Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Thank you all. That is it for today's tough conversation. Thank you again to each of you for being open and honest and vulnerable and willing to share your experiences and your little bit of wisdom. Tony Hines from adoptionsupport.org, Daryl Conquering Bear Crow, Matthew Anthony, Stephanie Euler, Keith Shirillo, and Abby Wiggum. Thank you each for sharing your story. You can find links to their works on our website, fosteringfamilies-today.org. And while there, why not check out information on our upcoming webinars? And thank you to the team behind Fostering Families Today who make it happen, especially to the newest member of the team, Jordan Taylor. She's our intern. Everybody wish her good luck as she goes forward in her journalism career. I'm Valerie Edwards. Thank you for being with me today. I'll see you next time here on Fostering Families Today with another tough conversation. Have a good day, everyone.